What could be simpler than plug and play? The idea of it is that if I plug a device into my computer, it just works and I don't have to worry about it. Well, you'd be surprised. There's a lot more involved than you might imagine. What does it do? Well, it automates settings for system resources. We're going to talk about system resources later on. So for now, I'm just going to leave that alone and we'll talk about what those system resources are. Second, it loads drivers. So it takes them from the driver store and puts them in the drivers folder. Let's take a look at those. The driver store is here. So let's just go here. I'm going to go to this PC, C drive, Windows, System 32, and then down to driver store. Now this has in the file repository here all of the drivers that are pre-staged and ready to use that Windows has built into it. So it's going to look for drivers in here and it's going to copy those over to C, Windows, System 32, drivers, and put those drivers in here. Usually they have a .sys extension on them. So that's the second thing that it does, and we're going to talk more about that stuff a little bit later on. Third, it sets up power configurations. Many devices have to respond to the power settings that you set up in Windows, and so Plug and Play also does that. It's kind of important to know that any user can plug in a Plug and Play device and use it. But you have to be an administrator in order to install third-party drivers in the event that you need a third-party driver and the one in the driver store is not sufficient. So let's look at the sequence of events that Plug and Play does. The first thing it does is it reads a unique device ID number from the device firmware. So built into devices is a number. Built into the firmware, the hardware on the device, is a number. Windows looks up that number and then finds an INF file that corresponds with that number. Now let's take a look at what that looks like. I'm going to go to the device manager. And I will just find a driver here. Quite often I use the keyboard driver because it has a lot of the things that we're looking for. I'm going to go down to Properties, over to the Details tab, and then down here I'm going to look for the Hardware ID. And you see that this has a hardware ID of the vendor ID 04D9 and the product ID of 1605. That is the information that I need in order to find a driver that would work in Windows. I don't have to find it. Plug and Play has to find it. So it looks up this information on the hardware itself. And then it looks for an INF folder. There, it looks in the INF folder. Let's take a look at that. I'm going to go back to C, Windows, INF. Right here. And here you see a bunch of INF files. These are just plain text files. I can open this file and view the contents of it. So in these plain text files that are built in a very specific manner, by the way, it talks about, well, who is the manufacturer of that driver, and then gives a whole bunch of information that Windows reads. And using this information that it finds in the INF folder, let's go back here to our notes. It uses the information in this INF folder then to find the correct driver in the driver store that will work for that device, to move that driver or copy that driver from the driver store to the drivers folder here. It also will make an entry into the registry and into the device manager. So that device manager that we just looked at a moment ago, do I still have it up here? Yeah, no, I don't. Let's go back to it. The device manager. So it makes an entry for that device here in the device manager. and it also makes an entry in the registry for that device, so that when the computer starts, it knows how to load that device. So it's doing a lot of things in the background here. One last thing that it does, I didn't mention yet, is it sets up, well, I mentioned it up here, it sets up the system resources for that device. And again, we will talk about what those system resources are in the next video down here. So don't get too hung up on what we mean by system resources here. Now, if a driver cannot be found in the driver store that works for that particular device, it will go ahead and make an entry in the device manager. Well, I closed it again. In the device manager, it will make an entry there, but it will put a little yellow triangle there, and which means, yeah, there's an entry for it, but there's no driver, and you need to go out and find your own stinking driver for it. All right, so that's what Plug and Play does. It's a lot more involved than you might imagine. In the next video, then, we will take a look at these system resources, what they are, and how devices might use those system resources.